Letters from Spain. Letter 20. The Spanish Civil War. Hello. As I mentioned in my last podcast, it's been pretty hard to do a podcast about Spanish life when pretty much everything has been turned upside down these last few weeks. Normally, I take inspiration from what I can see on any given week or from a recent trip in the country. But, I'm just seeing the inside of my apartment and occasionally the inside of a grocery store. Everyone's wearing masks and everyone is wearing gloves. And, it's not a time to be meditating about the beauties of Mediterranean culture, to say the least. But, I can't leave this podcast season incomplete. I just have one episode to go to make a nice, round, even 20 episodes, which is the end of the second season. You can't leave the season unfinished. That's just irresponsible. What am I, the Game of Thrones people? I'm gonna reduce the total number of seasons of the episode. Episodes in the season. That's crazy. Anyway, well, since it's hard to talk about day-to-day Spanish life during these coronavirus times, I thought it'd be a good time to revisit the last time in Spain's history when daily life was turned upside down. And I'm talking, of course, about the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. In this podcast, I'm not going to do a real thorough history of the war. I am not qualified to do that, and in any case, if you want that, there are plenty of great books on the market. Even if I wanted to list all the major writers on the war, I'd be here all night. There are just tons of books. In fact, from what I've read, the Spanish Civil War is only behind World War II in the number of books dedicated to the subject. As in, it's the second most written about war in history, and that's pretty crazy when you consider that, more people died in World War I, a lot more people died in World War I, and more people even died during the Vietnam War. So it's not, in terms of casualties, the most important war of all time, but the conflict has an enduring fascination, and this is for a few reasons. So here is the basic background. Spain came out of the 19th century in pretty bad shape. In the Napoleonic invasions in the early 1800s, ideas of constitutional government were successfully introduced into the country. And after that, things were never quite the same for the Spanish monarchy. There was tension everywhere. There was tension between the monarchy and the church, between the church and the people, between advocates for different branches of the royal family, between the rich and the poor, and liberals and monarchists, and Carlists and anarchists. And that's just the beginning. And by the way, a Carlist is someone who's supporting a different claimant for the throne. Spain was losing its overseas colonies, a process that culminated in the humiliating defeat of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And that's when the decadence of Spain's power sunk in for a lot of people. So coming into the 20th century, Spain had lost most of its colonies. It still had a few colonies in North Africa. It was rife with tension, and it was economically backward. Industrialization had come very late to the country, and for most of the country, industrialization hadn't come at all. Spain was still mostly agricultural. And not only that, but the country was highly decentralized as it is now. Each region of the country had its own organization, its own politics. Many regions had their own languages and their own cultures. In many places, in the places where there was industrialization, like Barcelona and Asturias, organized labor had become a powerful force that limited and conflicted with the government's authority. And this included labor unions and anarchists. Anarchism was a very popular force. Meanwhile, in an attempt to get rid of corrupt and inefficient government, Miguel Primo de Rivera seized power in a military coup in 1923. Now, Spain has had a lot of military coups in its history, okay? This is just one of many, and of course it was not going to be the last. Primo de Rivera, it's hard to say, Primo de Rivera ruled for about 7 years. until he too had to renounce power basically just because he was unpopular, and also the worldwide economic depression of 1929 and the early 30s basically eroded whatever support he had. Um, by this time, there was some popular support for democracy, and so the king absconded. The king left the country basically, and the Second Republic was born. The Second Republic, the Spanish Second Republic, which has often been compared with the unsuccessful Weimar Republic in Germany, survived for 5 very tense years, from 1931 to 1936. And as you could imagine, if you've ever lived in a democratic government, democracy didn't really heal the rifts in Spanish society. Political tensions spilled into violence all too often. There were street fights, riots, brutality between bosses and workers, brutality between workers and bosses. There was a violent uprising in Asturias, which Francisco Franco put down using troops from northern Africa, and nobody was satisfied. There were conservative parties, fascist parties, liberal parties, anarchists, and socialists who most of the time didn't even bother participating or voting because they thought the whole system was broken, and it basically was. Um, after many years of back and forth between the forces of liberalism and anti-liberalism, an unsteady and very ineffective center-left coalition seized control in 1936. And of course, this is just the beginning. The military, meanwhile, had been secretly planning an uprising to seize control, as they had done many times in the past. They had been planning this for some time. There was the spark that set off the conflict eventually was the assassination of a man named José Calvo Sotelo, who was a conservative politician who was killed by the bodyguards of a socialist party leader. Anyway, shortly after this, basically all around the country, military units in every province and region tried to seize control. Now, if the plan had gone perfectly, there would have been no war. They would have just taken control in a day or so, but it didn't go as planned. Not everywhere. In the weeks following the start of the uprising, which was on July 17, the rebel forces controlled about a third of the country. It included most of Spain's north, Galicia, Asturias, I think the Basque, no, most of the Basque country, I think. Most of the inner parts of the country, Castile, and the southern coast, sort of near Malaga, right? But the government maintained control of Madrid, and they maintained control of the prosperous eastern coast of Valencia and Barcelona. So the government had, at this point, most of the people still under its control. Now, at this, and they didn't seem to be in such a bad situation. In fact, they had more fighting men. They had big cities, they had big factories, and they had money. They had more money than the rebels. Most of the areas I mentioned that went into the rebel hands have a fairly low population density and are mostly agricultural. So if no outside party, and by outside party I mean if no country outside of Spain had gotten involved, it seems probable that the rebellion would have been defeated. But that, of course, didn't happen. Spain became like the laboratory of Europe where all of the new radical ideologies came to clash for the first time. The 30s was a time of ideological extremism after the First World War, after the economic devastation of the late 20s and the 30s. It polarized all of Europe, and all these ideologies were competing for the soul of Europe. And now Spain was an opportunity for them to try out their efficacy. So, fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, they came to the side of the rebels of the military coup, and Stalin's Soviet Russia offered supplies to the government, to the republic. Most of the rest of the world's governments wanted no part in the conflict, though. They didn't want to be dragged into another world war. They had just gone through the First World War. Of course, they didn't avoid it in the end. So England, France, and the United States, and they signed a non-intervention pact which forbid them to give or even sell weapons to the Spanish government. You can imagine it put them into quite a disadvantage to have Hitler sending planes and tanks, and it's Italy sending planes and tanks and lots of troops. Meanwhile, the Spanish Republic got some help from Stalinist Russia, but not nearly as much. So people from all over the world began to pour into Spain. There were lots of Italians and German soldiers, as I just mentioned. In fact, my girlfriend's grandfather, her mother's father, was one of these Italian soldiers who eventually, after the war, settled in Spain and married a Spanish woman, which is why my girlfriend has an Italian last name. On the Republican side, there were volunteers from all over. There were people from Ireland, England, the United States, France, and even some Germans and Italians who didn't like Nazism and didn't like fascism. They came and they were, for the most part, inexperienced, idealistic young men, and they just wanted a chance to fight against fascism. Most famously, George Orwell was one of them. And they formed the iconic International Brigades. So, needless to say, the idealism and the heroism of these young volunteers wasn't enough to stop German tanks and fighter planes and bombs. Basically, the Republic found itself outgunned, and meanwhile, so the organization of the rebel side was soon consolidated under Francisco Franco. He wasn't originally in control of the rebellion, but eventually he emerged as the most prominent leader. He was fairly young at the time, but he had a lot of military experience. He made a name for himself by leading these crack African troops in Spain's wars to suppress colonial uprising in its North African colonies. In fact, Franco had been banned to the Canary Islands right before the conflict because he was considered dangerous, but he probably should have just been arrested. And he was able to escape the Canary Islands, get to North Africa, bring over the North African troops, and this is how he seized control. Meanwhile, the Republican side did not really consolidate so easily. There was the Republican government, the government that had been voted into place, but the authority quickly sort of dissolved. There were many left-wing parties. They had their own organizations. There were, as I mentioned, the anarchists. There were the unions. There were communists. Many types of communists. There were Stalinist communists. There were anti-Stalinist communists. George Orwell, he by chance joined an anti-Stalinist communist brigade, and then eventually he had to flee Spain because the Stalinists had seized control and they were purging their power. They're purging they're consolidating their power, I should say. Anyway, so in a series of bloody battles, the rebel forces wore down the Republicans. They had the German bombs. Most famously, they bombed the city of Guernica in the Basque Country. They had tanks. Madrid was under siege for months and months. And life for the civilian population had taken a dark turn. There were summary executions on both sides of the lines. Neighbors denounced neighbors. People were taken from their houses and shot and buried in anonymous graves. The famous poet Federico Garcia Lorca was killed by the rebels and countless others. And Spain to this day is the country with the most mass graves in the world after Cambodia. And there are still probably hundreds of thousands of people who are buried in the country undiscovered. So that is pretty dark. There are some amazing photos I've seen on the Republican side, especially in Barcelona, where the working parties had a lot of power. They started burning churches and killing priests, and it was just as brutal on the rebel side, if not more brutal. So it was a very, very dark time. But to make this long and sad story short, the rebels won. Franco seized power in 1939. He conquered Madrid. He conquered Barcelona. And he didn't give up his power until his death in 1975. His dictatorship effectively kept the country poor and backward for another 30 years. To this day, people who grew up in the opening years of Franco's reign, people who are senior citizens now, are very noticeably shorter than their children and their grandchildren. And this is because during those years there was widespread malnutrition and they didn't grow up tall. After Franco's very timely demise in 1975, Spain finally did make the transition to democracy, in no small part thanks to King Juan Carlos I, whom Franco had appointed to be his successor. Franco thought that Juan Carlos was just going to continue the dictatorship, but Juan Carlos surprised a lot of people. In 1978, the Spanish Constitution was voted into being, and modern Spain was born. So, as you can see, Spain has historically had a lot of tensions running through it. As I mentioned, there's religious, class tensions, regional tensions, political tensions. It's a tinderbox. And the same is true today, although thankfully to a lesser extent. Spain still has regional tensions, most notably Catalonia and the Basque Country, and it's still difficult to talk about the Civil War. Franco's Spain didn't end that long ago. No, 1975 wasn't that long ago. Many people remember it. Many people, they're living veterans of the Spanish Civil War on both sides. Probably not many. In any case, civil wars, they're just inherently painful because there's a sense of betrayal and distrust everywhere. Even in America, our Civil War, which happened a long time before Spain's Civil War, still causes controversy. We still argue about the statues and the names of generals and all this, right? Well, imagine in Spain. Imagine if our Civil War happened in the 30s. So it'll be interesting to see how this current coronavirus crisis affects Spain. Maybe nothing will really change. Maybe we'll just go back to normal. Maybe it will strengthen xenophobia and the populist right-wing party Vox will gain control and do some terrible things. Or maybe it will engender a new sense of solidarity and unity in its citizens. I have no idea. Who can say at this point? Spanish politics is difficult to predict. But Spanish culture is a different matter. Spanish culture, it survived a century of conflict, a bloody civil war, a depressive and repressive dictatorship, and I think Spanish culture is going to emerge from this crisis too. Sooner or later, it's only a matter of time. Thank you.